thread from a doctor working in the ICU here in Alberta about some of the heartbreaking conversations she's been having to have with patients and their families. It's one example, and it's stunning. I'll share that with you here in a few moments. First off, how the rest of the year may pan out in the pandemic. Dr. Raywat Deonandan is an epidemiologist specializing in global health out of the University of Ottawa, joining us here this morning. Good morning. How are you today?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I guess it sort of depends on where you are in the country, what this fall and winter will look like. But in general, uh, sort of based on what we saw last year, but with the vaccination numbers, what might we expect, starting with this fall?
Yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question. As you know, it depends where you live in the country. It depends where you live in the world. And it depends on a number of factors that still might happen. But in general, I think the prognosis is good. I think this current wave, the fourth wave, the Delta wave, is scheduled to subside sometime this fall, probably November or so. Again, assuming some things happen and some things don't happen. And as the vaccination rates increase, we might have sufficient immunity built into the population to prevent subsequent waves. So we're looking down the barrel of likely endemicity by sometime next year, early next year. And by that I mean a acceptable level of background transmission that will not lead to further waves and therefore will not lead to closing of society. So I think that's where we're going.
Yeah. You say depending on some things happening or not happening. What kind of things are you thinking about?
Well, throwing the doors open and throwing out the mask mandate suddenly, suddenly not using the so-called vaccine passports the way they should be using. If we were to throw all caution to the wind, then all bets are off. On the other hand, though, that would cause a short-term, incredible amount of suffering and havoc, but it would lead to so much population immunity by way of recovery that we might end up in the same place anyway. So that's not advisable, by the way. I'm not advising that. I think we should seek vaccination as much as we can. But yeah, we should definitely avoid doing anything to encourage exposure and transmission until we get sufficient vaccine uptake.
What vaccination numbers do you think we need? Because, as we've gone through this and we've heard the prognostications about what might happen and what levels of vaccination we need in order to improve the situation, what would be the latest thinking as far as percentages?
Well, the complication, if thinking about that, is we don't know what the exact reproduction number of the virus is. You never know until it's over. And the reproduction number, as a reminder, is the average number of people that an infected individual will infect throughout the course of their infection. And we don't really know how much the current Delta variant has diminished the ability of the vaccines to stop transmission. But assuming the reproduction number is around 5 to 8, and assuming that Delta reduces vaccine efficacy down to 88% or so, some quick back of the envelope calculations suggest we'll need about 91% of the total population to be immune before we start seeing some extraordinary things happen.
Wow, that's a lot higher than what we were hearing earlier.
Yes, it is, because Delta has changed the game and is so more contagious than the previous variants that the thresholds have really shifted.
So, in the short term, in this fall, that's one thing. But in endemic, which here in Alberta, that was thought that's where we were getting to at the end of August. In fact, that's the direction the government was going, and the chief medical officer of health here, and that has clearly not been the case. But this is the light at the end of the tunnel, which it'll be a full 2 years at that point if we're talking about sort of spring of the coming year.
Yes, yeah. Now, what does endemic mean? Again, it means a level of transmission that is acceptable without causing more waves. It's not ideal. Herd immunity is ideal, push this thing completely out of our borders, but that's likely not going to happen, at least not everywhere. Um, but something people have to remember is that we had a coronavirus pandemic like this 120 years ago or so, 1890, and that coronavirus eventually became one of the common cold strains we have today. So this is not permanent. This is just this generation has to deal with this, and it will recede to the background eventually. So pandemics have a beginning and an end. Here in Canada, I think we're closer to the end than the beginning. Globally, we might be closer to the beginning because we can't get vaccine to most of the rest of the world in time. But here, we're going to do fairly well. And again, the key is get vaccines in as many arms as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's obviously been key. That's been the key message. That has continued to be the key message. Do we see another sort of harsh lockdown in any way? I know that there have been a number of medical professionals who have been calling for that in Alberta because of the much worse situation that we have going on here right now.
Yeah, I think Alberta and Saskatchewan might be looking down that barrel. I'm sad to say. I think it was avoidable. The rest of the country, I don't see it happening. But you can still avoid it, again, by using those vaccine passports to high effect and everyone lining up to get their shots. So at this point in the pandemic, especially here in Canada, everything is in our own hands. It's not the virus's fault anymore. It's our own fault because we have the tools to combat it. We're just not using them to high effectiveness.
We shall see if enough people jump on board and use the tools. Dig into the toolbox. Doc, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And talking about Dr. Raywat Deonandan.